had always envisioned a loving and supportive marriage, especially during pregnancy, but reality turned out to be far from what she had hoped. At 24, carrying her first child, she found herself feeling utterly alone despite being with her husband, Jake. In the early days of their relationship, Jake had been affectionate, attentive, and kind, qualities that made her believe he would be a good husband and father. However, as soon as they got married, something changed. The man who once held her hand and whispered sweet words now barely acknowledged her growing belly. He showed no interest in their unborn child, never asking about doctor's visits, never rubbing her aching back, and never offering to carry heavy grocery bags. Emma tried to brush it off at first, thinking maybe he was just overwhelmed or struggling to adjust to the idea of fatherhood. But the more she excused his behavior, the worse it became. Whenever she tried to talk to him about her worries, he dismissed her concerns or outright ignored her. He never entertained discussions about baby names or nursery decorations. Worse, he refused to spend money on baby essentials, always claiming he had more pressing expenses. Instead of thinking about their growing family, he talked about how he wanted to go to the casino once he had extra cash. His attitude toward her also grew harsher. If she complained about anything, no matter how small, he would snap at her, telling her to shut up and clean the house. The man she had once loved now treated her as an afterthought, a housekeeper, rather than a wife carrying his child. The emotional neglect was crushing, and she couldn't help but wonder if she had done something to cause this shift. Had she been too needy? Too sensitive? Maybe she had put too much pressure on him by expecting him to be as excited about the baby as she was. She held on to hope that he would change once the baby arrived, but deep down, a growing part of her knew he never would. The idea of spending the rest of her life feeling unloved and invisible was unbearable, but she also felt trapped. With a child on the way, leaving him didn't feel like an option. She convinced herself to endure it, for the sake of the baby, for the sake of the marriage she had committed to, even as her heart told her she was fighting a losing battle. Feeling isolated and emotionally abandoned, Emma found herself turning to the only person who seemed to care, Jake's father, Richard. At 57, Richard was a man of few words, but unlike his son, he listened. It started with small conversations over breakfast or while tidying up the house. Emma would make a passing comment about her back pain, and Richard would nod, acknowledging her discomfort, sometimes even offering her a seat or suggesting she take a break. These little gestures felt foreign yet comforting, a stark contrast to Jake's cold indifference. Over time, Emma started confiding in Richard more, especially on the nights when Jake would come home late without a word, or when he brushed off her attempts to share her feelings. One evening, after another particularly frustrating encounter with Jake, where he laughed off her concerns about their finances and instead joked about spending money on a weekend of drinking with his friends, Emma found herself breaking down in front of Richard. He was sitting at the kitchen table, quietly reading, when she let out a deep sigh and muttered, "I don't know how much longer I can do this." Richard looked up from his book, his eyes studying her carefully, before he simply said, "Talk to me." It was the first time in months that anyone had asked her how she felt. Before she knew it, the words poured out of her. She told him everything, how Jake ignored her, how he refused to acknowledge their baby, how he snapped at her for the smallest things, how she was scared of what the future would look like if things stayed the same. Richard listened intently, nodding at the right moments, occasionally offering a quiet "I see," or "That's not right." When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. "A man should take care of his family," he said firmly, shaking his head. "Jake, he wasn't raised like this." His disappointment was evident, but there was something else in his expression, something that looked a lot like sympathy. From that night on, their conversations became more frequent. Emma found herself seeking Richard out, not just for household matters, but for comfort. He was steady, reliable, and most importantly, kind. He asked if she had eaten, reminded her to rest, and even offered to drive her to her doctor's appointments when Jake refused. She knew it was dangerous to rely on him so much, but she couldn't help it. Richard made her feel safe, seen, and cared for in a way Jake never did. With every soft-spoken reassurance, with every time he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder and told her she deserved better, a shift began to happen inside her. She wasn't just grateful for Richard's kindness, she was drawn to it. And before she even realized it, her heart had started to lean toward him. The living situation changed when Jake announced that he would be traveling for work shortly after the baby's birth. The timing was unfortunate, but he didn't seem particularly concerned about how Emma would manage on her own. Instead of offering solutions himself, he turned to Richard and asked, "Would you mind staying with Emma for a while after she's discharged? Just until things settle down." It wasn't a request made out of thoughtfulness for his wife. It was pure convenience. Jake needed someone to take care of Emma and the baby in his absence, and as far as he was concerned, his father was the easiest option. When Richard later recounted this conversation to Emma, there was something unsettling about it. It wasn't just the fact that Jake was willing to offload his responsibilities onto someone else. It was the way Richard had responded. "I told him, I'm still a man, you know. Who knows what could happen if I live with her?" Richard admitted, his voice tinged with something between humor and something far less innocent. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't sure whether she was more shocked by Richard's words or by what Jake had said in response. "And what did he say?" she asked, already fearing the answer. Richard let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "He just said, 'Ah?' and left it at that." Emma stared at him, waiting for more. Waiting for some sign that Jake had reacted with anger or even mild concern. But there was nothing. No protest, no warning, not even a half-hearted defense of his wife's honor. He simply didn't care. That realization hit her harder than she expected. Jake hadn't just neglected her emotionally, he had effectively abandoned her altogether. He didn't see her as a partner, didn't value her as the mother of his child. She had spent so much time trying to convince herself that his behavior was just a phase, that deep down, he still cared. But this moment made it painfully clear he didn't. And somehow, knowing that hurt more than anything else. Richard, on the other hand, was there. He was always there. Every time she felt overwhelmed, every time she needed a kind word or a comforting presence, it was Richard who stepped in, not Jake. It was Richard who checked in on her, Richard who helped with things around the house, Richard who made sure she had what she needed. And now, it was Richard who would be staying with her after the baby was born. The thought should have scared her. It should have made her uneasy. But instead, it filled her with something else entirely. Relief. Relief that she wouldn't be alone. Relief that someone actually cared. Relief that, in the absence of a husband who had long since stopped acting like one, there was still someone who saw her, who valued her, who wanted to take care of her. And that relief, she knew, was dangerous. The night everything changed, Emma knew she had already crossed an invisible line long before anything physical happened. It wasn't in a single moment, but in the slow, steady pull toward Richard, the way she sought his presence, the way her heart felt steadier when he was near. She had spent months feeling invisible, a burden to the man who was supposed to love her. But Richard had made her feel seen, cared for, and that feeling had become impossible to ignore. She knew it was wrong, knew she shouldn't have allowed herself to lean on him the way she did, but she had been desperate for warmth, for comfort, for something that reminded her she was still a person, not just an afterthought in Jake's life. That night, Richard found her crying again. She had been sitting on the edge of the bed, running her hands over her swollen belly, the weight of everything pressing down on her. The reality of her situation felt unbearable. Her husband's absence, the loneliness, the uncertainty of what would happen after the baby arrived. When Richard sat beside her, she didn't pull away. He didn't say anything at first, just placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch warm and grounding. "You don't have to do this alone," he said softly, his voice laced with something deeper than sympathy. She turned to look at him, searching his face for some kind of answer. Was he saying what she thought he was? Was this just another moment of comfort, or was there something more? Richard exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Jake doesn't deserve you," he said. "He doesn't see what he has, but I do." The words sent a shiver down her spine, not from fear, but from something far more dangerous, recognition. Because deep down, she had already known. She had known in the way he looked at her, the way his hands lingered just a little longer than they should, the way his voice softened when he spoke to her. She had known in the way she felt when he was near, safe, wanted, something she hadn't felt in a long time. When he reached out, she didn't stop him. When he brushed a tear from her cheek, she didn't turn away. And when he whispered, "Let me take care of you," she didn't say no. She should have. She knew she should have. But in that moment, with her heart aching and her body starved for affection, she let herself fall. She let herself be held, let herself be kissed, let herself believe, if only for a little while, that she wasn't alone. But the moment it was over, reality came crashing down. She lay there, staring at the ceiling, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. There was no taking it back, no pretending it hadn't happened. She had crossed a line she could never uncross. And now, there was no way to go back to the way things were before. The morning after, Emma woke with a crushing weight on her chest, the reality of what she had done suffocating her before she even opened her eyes. The room felt different, heavier, as if the air itself knew she had crossed an irreversible line. She lay still, her hands resting protectively over her swollen belly, the warmth of Richard's touch still lingering on her skin like a ghost of a mistake she couldn't take back. For a moment, she wished she could pretend it hadn't happened, that the night before had been nothing more than a fleeting dream, an illusion brought on by desperation and loneliness. But the truth was undeniable. She had given in, and now there was no going back. Guilt clawed at her, but it was tangled with something even more dangerous, relief. Because for the first time in a long time, she had felt wanted. She had felt safe. Richard had looked at her the way Jake never did, had touched her like she was precious, not an inconvenience. And that was what scared her the most. Not just the betrayal, but the terrifying realization that she didn't regret the way he had made her feel. She regretted the consequences, the shame, the knowledge that she had become something she never thought she would be. But in those moments, wrapped in his arms, she had felt more like herself than she had in months. But what now? What was she supposed to do? She was still Jake's wife, still carrying his child. And yet, after last night, she could no longer see herself as just his. Richard had changed something in her, or maybe he had simply awakened what had been buried beneath months of neglect and loneliness. Either way, there was no erasing what had happened, no undoing the way their lives had just shifted into something complicated and irreversible. Her mind raced through the possibilities, none of them good. Would Richard pretend nothing had happened? Would he expect something more? And what if Jake somehow found out? Her husband had never shown real concern for her, but betrayal had a way of making men wake up, of making them possessive over things they had neglected. And then there was the baby, her child, the one innocent soul in all of this, the one who deserved better than to be born into this mess. She had promised herself that no matter what, she would be a good mother. But how could she be, knowing the choices she had made? Tears burned her eyes as she sat up, pressing a hand to her forehead. She had broken something that could never be fixed. There was no perfect way forward, no path that didn't end in hurt. No matter what choice she made, someone would suffer. Jake, Richard, herself. But the one person she couldn't let suffer was the child inside her. And if she truly wanted to be a mother worth loving, she would have to decide what kind of woman she was going to be.